there's a gap between what people want and what they have in their lives, what they want their lives to be and what they are. And that gap, obviously, there's all kinds of external things there, access to resources and systemic issues and all kinds of things. But there are internal things as well. And so for me, when I'm talking about executive functioning, I'm talking about everything that makes up that gap internally. So a lot of that is the stuff that everybody discusses, like initiation and working memory and prioritization, or however people break it down. But a lot of it too is understanding more about the input, especially when it comes to ADHD, understanding more about the process by which we notice some things and not others, and why the brain is prioritizing that, and all that kind of stuff. So that gap between having an idea of what you want to do or intend to do and then actually doing it, that's executive functioning, and that's where a lot of the focus is. And I try and put more emphasis too on, before even deciding what it is, what you want to do, how that piece is influenced by the executive functioning.
ADHD Rewired, episode 370. This is the podcast for those of us with really good intentions and a slightly wandering attention. I'm Eric Tivers. I'm a licensed clinical social worker by training and a coach by design. I'm your host, and I have ADHD. ADHD Rewired is more than just a podcast. We are a community. We are wired for connection, and you are not alone. Go to ADHDrewired.com to learn how you can join us in our free secret Facebook group. Get additional resources for every episode, including links to any resources we mention on today's show. You can support us on Patreon, sign up for our email newsletter. You can request podcast postcards to distribute to your clients and support groups, and you can learn all about our intensive online video-based coaching and accountability groups. You can do all of this at our website, ADHDrewired.com. We know that starting is the hardest part, so let's get started. Welcome back to another episode of ADHD Rewired. Today's guest is Brandon Tessers. Brandon is a licensed clinical professional counselor, a professional actor, and playwright. He's an amateur singer-songwriter, a former school teacher and tutor, a spectacular dungeon master, and an enthusiastic, if sometimes ill-prepared husband and father. He's been helping children and adults with their executive functioning for over a decade, and has always been focused on working with people who exist outside the norm in one way or another. He does that now as the founder and director of Effective Artistry, a therapy and coaching practice focused on helping people who consider themselves neurodivergent and creative. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here. I'm laughing.
One of the really cool things that we discovered in our initial conversation a few months ago is that we're basically neighbors. Like, you live in the next town over.
Yeah. A couple minutes away.
Literally a couple minutes away. And in the stage of COVID, I mean, we would love to, I would wish we were doing this, in person. When I hear this, there's a therapist who's into ADHD and is a musician. It's like, shit, we should get together and, and it's like, oh yeah, COVID. So anyways, how have you been?
I've been good. I'm still counting on getting together for a beer or something after all this.
I'm hoping for, absolutely.
I've been good. It's these times and everybody has their different struggles with that, but generally doing well.
So you just recently started this practice and you said that it's been going really well. Tell me about kind of what you do. Because I love this idea of focusing sort of on the arts. So tell me what you do about your practice.
Well, so we do therapy and coaching individually primarily, although we're starting to do some group work as well.
Groups the bomb. I love group work.
I've done a lot of group work in my career, and it's not my particular cup of tea. I love being able to focus on with one person, but some of our coaches and other people enjoy the group work. So. And I think it's such an important way of doing the work, because getting people to be able to interact with each other, that learn from each other. We focus, my big focus is on executive functioning, which, I use that phrase a little bit differently than a lot of other people use it. Not because I think necessarily that it's more important than other things. I just think it's less commonly understood. So I'm trying to put my efforts into things where there's there is value that is not as commonly available, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So how do you look at it differently? Well,
so to me, executive functioning, and I'm kind of a weirdo when it comes to language. I try to be very precise because it's so important. It's a term that people use to mean a lot of different things. It's one of those, like mindfulness or hell, like, oh, excuse me. I don't know if swearing is acceptable.
I think I've already sworn in the first minute, so okay. I think we're okay.
So executive functioning is one of those terms that just means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Like even if you look at the established kind of experts that have written books in the field, they'll break it down in different ways. Some have 3 subgroups and some have 28 or whatever.
Something that Russell Barkley, I've heard him talk about how one of the problems is there's like 51 like definitions of executive functioning out in the clinical literature.
Right. So executive functioning is one of those terms that means different things to different people. And language is a living thing. So none of those definitions are incorrect, right? Like however we use it is how we use it. But I just try to be clear on how I'm using it when I talk to people. For me, there's a gap between what people want and what they have in their lives, what they want their lives to be and what they are. And that gap, obviously, there's all kinds of external things there, access to resources and systemic issues and all kinds of things. But there are internal things as well. And so for me, when I'm talking about executive functioning, I'm talking about everything that makes up that gap internally. So a lot of that is the stuff that everybody discusses, like initiation and working memory and, prioritization or however people break it down. But a lot of it too is understanding more about the input, especially when it comes to ADHD, understanding more about the process by which we notice some things and not others, and why the brain is prioritizing that and, all that kind of stuff. So that gap between having an idea of what you want to do or intend to do and then actually doing it, that's executive functioning. And that's where a lot of the focus is. And I try and put more emphasis too on before even deciding what it is, what you want to do, how that piece is influenced by the executive functioning.
So you're saying you put more focus on recognizing you're about to step on the bridge between intention to action?
More in the sense of, just to jump right into like what attention is and all that kind of thing, because we all know that attention deficit hyperactivity disorder is a terrible name because that's not what it is. That understanding that process of how does the brain determine which data is worth bringing into awareness and which isn't. And the fact that you and I could look at the exact same thing and see 2 completely different things because you're noticing pieces that I'm not, and I'm noticing pieces that you're not. Mm-hmm. So even at that first step of like that access to information, even though we're in a shared reality, a shared environment, that it's different for us from the very get-go.
All right. So, but one of the things you were saying is that you sort of talk about it a little bit differently, right?
Yeah. Well, right. Because you were asking about potential titles, and I mentioned the bathtub analogy because that's one that I throw out there a lot, which is the idea that to a tub, there's 3 important parts. There's the faucet that brings the water in, there's the tub that holds it while you're using it, and there's the drain that takes it away. And I have a lot of background in working in the kind of the gifted community, which is, full of great people, but a paradigm and terminology that I don't think is great necessarily in some ways, or at least is very flawed. So I've looked at a lot of...
You mean gifted as a terminology?
Yeah, gifted as terminology is a little problematic.
It's like this inverse like stigma sort of. It's like, I was talking about something the other day, and he was even saying something about how like, it's weird to say because it sounds like you're bragging. Because it sounds like then you think you're better than everyone else. And so I asked him like, well, do you think you are? And he's like, well, sometimes.
Well, he is sometimes, I use this analogy that I'm 6'5", and so I'm tall, and people notice that and they say that, oh, that's great. But the truth is that it's advantageous in some contexts and disadvantageous in others, and neutral in many. So it's great when I'm trying to reach something on a high shelf, and it's terrible when I'm in coach on a 14-hour flight across the Pacific.
Yeah.
And this comes up in ADHD conversation all the time too, where people will say, oh, it's a superpower or it's a curse. It's, debating. And the truth is the same, that it's advantageous in some contexts and disadvantageous in others, and doesn't matter in many contexts.
All right. So the bathtub.
Bathtub, right.
Bring this back.
So I looked at, yeah. No, I appreciate that. So I was kind of mentioning that as a way to talk about that, I've looked at a lot of neuropsych tests. And what we see a lot, especially with kids as time goes on, is that processing will be fine, working memory will be fine, but intake can be way high, right? Comprehensional intelligence, what data they're bringing in or how much they notice. So all three of those things need to work in concert and in balance with each other. And when there's a gap between any of them, it doesn't matter what it is compared to other people. It's what it is compared to the other parts of how you operate. So that's how I try and look at it when we are working on executive functioning. A lot of my work really starts with observation. Because a lot of times when we're talking, or when other people talk about executive functioning, there's a real focus on that external kind of thing, the observable, like do you take notes in the planner and to-do lists and stuff. And all that stuff is great and helpful and valid. But executive functioning, originally, the concept was about all internal stuff, that it's a set of cognitive processes that allow you to control your behavior. That's the original definition. So a lot of my work really just starts with helping people to notice things differently than what they're currently noticing, applying language to things so that they can just get a better sense of what's going on and make different decisions about what they want, or clearer decisions about what they want, before jumping straight into how do we execute what you're already wanting to do.
And how do you do that?
Well, a lot of it is language development, like I was just saying. I mentioned, I think before we started recording, that my wife sometimes gets annoyed with me because I just always talk in this language. And she'll have to say, like, I don't need to talk to our therapist right now. Like, please just be a normal person. But I'm obsessed with language, with precision in language, because we know that language affects what our brain prioritizes. So in other words, like, until I say what I'm about to say in 5 seconds, everybody listening to this is not aware of the feeling of the chair or the floor underneath them. And as soon as I say it, you become aware of it. That data was always there, but the brain was saying it's not relevant until you hear my words.
And my favorite example of that is actually our nose, because our brain tunes it out until we actually realize, if we actually you don't mean to shift your eyes, but pay attention to the fact that you can actually see your nose right now. And it's like, oh, yeah, there it is. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. So the thing about this process is that it happens pre-consciously, meaning that we can't deliberately decide what to be aware of, because in order to do that, it would have to have been in our awareness to make the decision in the first place. And I'm certainly not a biologist and couldn't go into the greatest detail, but this process actually starts outside of the brain, in the nerves, in the sensory nerves. So we can't deliberately and directly take control over it, but we can apply language to give the brain different things to prioritize and look at, and then it will start prioritizing things differently. So a lot of mindfulness exercises are a lot about this. I can't force my brain to start noticing visuals that it's currently filtering out. But if I give myself the task of look around the room and find 4 things that are red, then the brain will start prioritizing that information.
So it's really focusing on what do you want to do instead of what do you not want to do.
Yeah, well, I always say there's 3 steps here. It's you got to know what you want, then you make a plan, then you execute. And we teach that in reverse order to kids for obvious reasons in how they develop. We teach them to execute and then to plan. And we don't do a lot of teaching on how to figure out what it is that you want. There's a lot of crises that happen for kids at that 17-year-old, 18-year-old age where it's like, we've always just asked you to do things and never asked you what you wanted. And now all of a sudden we're saying that the rest of your life depends on the decision of whether to go to college, where to go to college, what to study. So figure it out real fast. So I always, the simplest solution is the best solution. But if it doesn't work, you got to get more complicated, which is often the case with ADHD people, right? So yeah, we want to start by improving execution. But if that's a struggle, it might be that the plan is wrong. And if the plan is not working, it might be that you're not really clear on what it is that you want, because you're not clear on what it is that you're noticing or not noticing.
When we first talked a couple months ago, I think I wrote this down. Maybe you wrote this in your notes to me. I'm like, this is a really well-crafted sentence. Maybe you wrote this. Executive functioning isn't about getting better at forcing yourself to do the things you don't want to do. It's about aligning your goals with who you are.
Yeah. I think I might have written that. That sounds like something I said. Because the goal is...
Sounds good. Take you, sure. Yeah. It's, but I think part of that speaks to sort of the idea that like, so ADHD is a starting point to understand, if we're having struggles with something, right? But it doesn't, when someone asks like, what's the best thing to do about this situation if you have ADHD? And it's like, it depends, right?
Right.
Like, and I think that's what it sounds like partially what I'm hearing too, especially with this analogy that you're using with the bathtub analogy, is that you first have to start with what are you taking in? Is that?
Yeah, it's about having all those things work in tandem with each other. So it's what are you taking in? What are you holding? So attention to me, again, I'm going to say to me a lot because I'm trying to be clear that, this is how I use the language, and other people, if they use it differently and that's helpful, great. Because like you said, everybody has different things that help them. And, why would I spend any of my finite time or energy trying to take something away from somebody that works? But yeah, attention to me is kind of like a bandwidth, a conduit of I can take in X bits of data per second, right? So it's filtering out what gets that. And then that comes into awareness or working memory. And again, that's one of those terms people use differently. But when I use working memory, what I mean is, again, the technical definition is the space in your brain, in your mind, in which you can hold information that you can manipulate. To me, that's awareness, consciousness. So attention is kind of like the gateway or the pipe bringing things in. Once it's in there in the tub, that's working memory. And the brain then, it has problems it's trying to solve. Some of the stuff we notice, the brain is able to use that data in order to solve the problems. And so it stays there and helps out. Some of that, the brain says, okay, I noticed it, but it's not helping me with anything. So I get rid of it. And then of course, the drain processing into long-term memory, where working memory has finite room. Long-term memory is practically infinite, but the gate there is on getting things in, that it takes time and there's a process involved in that. So you want to make sure that you're noticing the right things, doing the right things with them when they're in your awareness, and then processing the right things so you can retrieve them to use later. And I don't even remember why I went back to the bathtub analogy now. Here's what I was thinking before is, to me, there's a difference between observation and analysis. There's what exists and what happens. And then there's when we use our intelligence to make decisions and guesses about why it happened, which is only really useful if we then can use that data to make a change that we want to make. So I think that's where we started with this, was talking about it's great to learn that you have ADHD because it can be really helpful. And in some cases, it's not. Whether in an individual, it can be helpful in some places and not in others, or from person to person.
Or symptom to symptom.
Symptom to symptom, right. Context to context. So to me, analysis is great when it helps. And when it's not helping you, when it's not useful, I'm not saying that it's inaccurate. I don't really care whether it's accurate or not. I'm a practitioner. I'm not a researcher. So I get to focus on what helps, what works. So to me, the question is, does your analysis allow you to does it either in and of itself help you, or does it allow you to test something to see if that analysis will help you? And if not, I don't need to get rid of it, but let's move on to finding something else that will help.
So what I want to do is take a quick break, and I want to find out how do we figure out what works and what kind of strategies and stuff we can use, and how the sort of the role, because you've talked a lot about the preciseness of language and how that piece is sort of important in figuring out how to figure out what the heck do we do with this, with, the challenges that we're having. So we will be right back. Support for ADHD Rewired comes from our coaching community. If you're listening to this on the day it came out, it means that our 24th season of coaching and accountability groups starts tomorrow. And for the very first time, we have 4 sections this season. Last season, Moira Mabin joined the ADHD Rewired coaching team, allowing us to offer a 3rd section at an earlier time, never before offered. And as we kick off our 24th season, we are so excited to welcome another new coach to our team, Roxy Martin. And as I am recording this on Friday evening, Even though group starts tomorrow, we actually have just a couple spots left in Roxy's group. So head on over to our website to see how you can snag one of those spots. But I am so excited about how much our coaching community has grown. And I am grateful for everyone who has contributed to its growth. I could not have done any of this alone. Together, we can do hard things. Now, if you missed our registration events or decided to wait until summer, go to coachingrewired.com and click on the big red button to add yourself to the summer interest list. If you've looked through our coaching page and still have some questions, we've got you covered. We added a FAQ menu at the top of our homepage where you can find the answers to some of our most frequently asked questions. Season after season, our coaching members work on more than just time management, goal setting, or long-term planning. We learn how to work with our ADHD so we can create our own roadmaps to reach our goals and create forward momentum. Through each season, I too am reminded that I can do hard things, and together we can do hard things. So if you've been listening to us for a while, or you're finding out about this for the very first time and are interested in our intensive online coaching and accountability groups, head on over to coachingrewired.com for more details and click on the red button to get your name added to our summer interest list. That's coachingrewired.com. Have you been looking for a co-working space to help cross things off your list? Well, look no further. Head on over to adultstudyhall.com to find out more about a brand new membership program for the ADHD community. The virtual doors will be opening soon to our Adult Study Hall membership community, where you can boost your productivity with real-time accountability over Zoom. If you've signed up to join this new community, I promise we're getting there. We are getting closer every week. For real, we are. It will be worth the wait. Did you know? We'll be offering a variety of Adult Study Hall or ASH sessions, from Adult Study Hall on demand to member-hosted sessions where you can post what time you want to be in Adult Study Hall and anyone in the community can join you. There are currently 5 ongoing member-hosted study halls scheduled Monday through Friday. Also included in the membership are the ASH Plus sessions, which will be facilitated working sessions to provide some structure and help to help you get the things done through intentional questions and progress check-ins. Our Adult Study Hall membership will give you a virtually around-the-clock accountability, so you don't have to work alone and you can finally get stuff done. Membership is just $19.99 a month, which includes all member-hosted study halls and access to all ASH Plus sessions. And the first 100 members to lock in their membership will do so for just $9.99 a month as the founding members of the Adult Study Hall community. As long as your membership stays active and you remain in good standing, your founder's rate will never increase for the lifetime of your membership. Go to adultstudyhall.com and add your name to the list to get your chance on locking in our founder's rate of only $9.99 a month. And then watch your email. That's adultstudyhall.com. All right, we are back. So we were talking about sort of language and identifying what kind of strategies we use. And during the break, we were just sort of reminiscing of the ADHD nature of both of us, trying to figure out where the heck we're going. And so maybe I'll share this as sort of completely tangential, but then we'll get into this. So, so many of us are doing life on Zoom right now. And so one of the things that I've recently started doing in my Zoom meetings, and I just turned this on, is I'll turn on the live transcript feature, because I always tell people in my coaching groups that the hardest question that they could ever ask me during group is, can you repeat what you just said? And now we have a strategy. I just look to the live transcript. I don't have to try to remember what I just said, and it's great.
Yeah, that's an incredible executive functioning strategy, to kind of take some of that. Because what's happening is our working memories are totally dedicated to reading each other in the moment and thinking about what we want to say next, and don't have any room left over for remembering what we said 3 minutes ago. So now we don't have to. You have it written down.
Right. It's it's funny because I don't listen to a lot of the interviews that I do anymore. And so when I do occasionally listen to it, I'm like, wow, that was a really good interview. I like barely even remembered that because I'm like so in the moment of it. It's just weird sort of phenomena.
Yeah, it really, I mean, you mentioned art. My background is like a performing artist. My undergrad's in acting. And it is a very similar kind of experience of in that moment. We use language, and I guess this can segue us into talking about language, but we use language like being fully present or fully aware in the moment that kind of conveys some sense of what the experience is, but isn't ultimately super meaningful. But I think this is part of what it is. It's that my whole working memory is dedicated to just navigating this moment, and there's not a whole lot left over to analyze it and put it into language that I can process for retrieval later.
Yeah. So when you're working with clients, so you're explaining to them the sort of these frameworks of executive functioning. How do you do that and use your model to help people identify kind of how to approach figuring out strategies that are helpful for them?
Yeah, well, the basic paradigm is that it is, experimental. It's empirical. It's we gather whatever information we have, which is going to primarily come from the client about themselves, and then I add whatever information I have in order to collectively, between the two of us, make our best guesses about what's something that could help change whatever this specific thing is that you're trying to work on.
Let me ask you this. So part of what you're saying does require a level of self-awareness, right?
Absolutely.
How do you help clients who either like you could see maybe there's a gap between what you're seeing and their awareness around what you're seeing, and those people who are just like, I don't know, like how do you get in the situation? I don't know.
Well, so self-awareness is often one of those kind of sub functions that's considered an executive function, and to me, I think it's the most important one because it dictates what data we're working with at the beginning, right?
Say that again, because I think that's so important, this idea of self-awareness as an executive function.
Yeah, self-awareness is often considered a sub-function, an executive function. And to me, I think it's the most important one because it dictates what information we are working with.
Yeah.
So everything you think, everything you feel, do, plan, whatever, is based on the things of which you are aware. There are all kinds of things in this world that are beyond any individual's awareness. And those things, you don't use them. They exist and they're important and you can understand that, but you're not going to use them if you're not aware of them. So that's why I have this big focus on trying to change what it is that we're aware of. Because when someone says, I don't know, they don't know. And it's not that I know better, that I have some analysis that I can say, oh, I think it's this or that, which I think sometimes is the idea of how this is supposed to work, is that an expert comes in and tells you what you should know about yourself. But instead, I can help kind of guide because it's all about resource management. The brain doesn't want to spend any of the finite resources we have, time, energy, attention, working memory space, whatever, unless there's a reason. So, we talk all the time in therapeutic circles or whatever about behavior. All behavior serves a purpose, right? That everything you do for a reason. And there's a gap in awareness and control that causes those problems. Your brain is making decisions with some level of your input. And that's how you go about doing the vast majority of what you do. We don't have the time to deliberately think through, oh, you know what? My mouth feels in a way that I identify as dry and therefore I need water. So let me reach for my water cup. That, it does it.
Right.
So that's where the language part comes in. That we often start with observation. A very common thing that I have with my clients is that pretty much every experience they have, they will break down into one of two buckets of fine or not fine, right? So they start to identify their lives in that way. Because again, we have the moment, we have what's happening right now.
Fine as like, okay, fine.
Fine as in okay, fine.
Yeah. Fine or find, like find my keys fine, or... Yeah.
Or another way to say it is just survivable or not survivable, right?
Okay.
Like okay or not okay.
Okay.
So once we're past the moment, all we have is what we can get out of our long-term memory. That data no longer exists in our environment. It's just what we access. And what we access is very limited because it's based first on what we noticed, then on how we processed it, then on how we stored it and how we retrieved it. So in other words, if you have an experience that you hate, you might say, man, this is making me really sad in your head, and process it in that way. And then it connects to other data that's also connected to sadness. So in the future, if someone asks you, how did you feel about it? You can remember, I was sad. But if you don't know the word sad, you can't process it in that way. So if someone were to say, how did you know how are you feeling? You're going to say, I don't know. Maybe at best you might say something like, I didn't like it. Right. So when we don't have precise language, we can't process and retrieve this information. So when I say to somebody, what was it better or worse when it was like that? When you made that change, or when this other person did this thing differently, did you like it better or worse? And I get answers that are, I don't know. A lot of time it comes down to the way that I've evaluated, the way that this client has evaluated their experience is basically either it's a problem and it really sucks and it's so bad I need help with it, or it's fine. And so the pattern then becomes, I'm fine until I'm not fine. And then when I'm not fine, I put in whatever work or get whatever help to get back to fine. But once I'm there, I stop, because there's no difference between fine and slightly more fine. You know what I mean?
I had a college professor said that if you ever have a client that says that they're fine, you got to probe, because fine is an acronym for fucked up, insecure, neurotic, and evasive. Which, if you kind of think about it, is totally what we're saying when we say we're fine.
Yeah, a lot of the time, really. Or another common one is tired, right? So all this language, all this wonderful language that we have as a species or as various cultures have developed, you have to know it to use it. So I do a lot of things like scales, for example, 1 to 10 scales or 1 to 100 scales, which are completely arbitrary and made up. What is the difference between an activity that takes you 20 points of energy versus 40 points of energy? It's all just to you. But it allows you then to remember, oh, that thing took 20 points of energy and that thing took 40, instead of just, I was tired.
Right. I tell people that when you're doing those kinds of scales, that it's a self-calibrating sort of approach that and you'll, for the first maybe even couple days or couple weeks might be you're getting sort of like you're calibrating, because maybe you'll just say that something was like a 5 out of 10. And then you realize the next day, you know what? I think yesterday was more of a 5 out of 10, because today felt like a 6.
Yeah. And
so it's this, I think there's a lot of value into doing sort of that kind of subjective assessment for a lot of things.
Scales like that, or again, language, whether it's tapping into language that exists or even just making up your own, right?
So you've made up a bunch of words around this stuff, haven't you?
I've made up so much. Usually I use existing words because I want to tap into something that's already there. But you've already heard me say things like observation versus analysis and how I use working memory or whatever, right?
Like you have, we were talking like the neuromechanics of ADHD. You're talking about like the axiomatic system, which I wrote down and still have no idea what that means.
So to me, I like to think of human behavior as an axiomatic system, which means that axioms are like certain given truths that you can then build on. If you accept A, B, C, and D, then everything else from there follows. So like math is an axiomatic system, and I don't claim to understand what that means particularly for math at all. That's not my area. But there are certain things that we have infinite variation among people. We all know that. We're all unique. No matter what things we have in common, there are differences. But there are certain underlying, I'm going to say, nigh universal processes or experiences, because I don't ever want to claim that I know everyone's thing. But attention, for example, is one of them. If you understand that piece, that we cannot be aware of everything that exists, and that even if you and I are standing side by side, we're having different experiences based on what our brain's prioritizing bringing in.
Yeah, I was meeting with some people yesterday, and I had this facilitator in this meeting, and she was talking about the parallax effect. And what you're describing to me really sounds like that. So you can have 3 people standing in 3 different positions, and they're all seeing the same thing, but because there's something that's in the middle of like the different positions, everyone's going to see the thing differently. So
Right.
it doesn't mean they're seeing something wrong. It just means they're from where they're standing is different.
Yeah. Well, I think, when we're talking about communication issues in relationships, a lot of the time this is what we're dealing with. Because again, to me, my made up language, I think of
Klingon, by the way.
I do not. I'm more of a Star Wars guy than a Star Trek guy, but really I'm a D&D guy more than anything. No, I think of communication as having 4 parts to it. There's the message that I'm intending to get across to you. So there's something happening in my head that I want you to be aware of or us to be able to share to move forward. So then there's what I do in order to try to communicate that knowledge, that message to you. That's number 2. Number 3 is of what I do, say, or nonverbal language or whatever, you will notice some of it and not other parts of it. Or you may notice things that I'm not aware of or had intent as part of the communication and assume is part of the communication. So that's 3. And then 4 is how you then interpret what you noticed. So we will never, ever, this is that kind of like existential isolation, right? We will never be exactly 100% on the same page. The goal of communication is to be close enough that it doesn't cause any problems for us. And when we get further off, there's kind of glitches in any of those 4 steps. And especially when you have ADHD, which at its root, a lot of it, and of course there's a lot in different directions, but a lot of it is about what do you notice versus what other people expect that you would notice or should notice. And it's kind of a bigger gap than normal. That this kind of causes a lot of that communication problems, a lot of the rejection sensitivity dysphoria and hypervigilance and all that kind of stuff.
So when you were talking about the communication, I'm actually right now listening to nonviolent communication. Have you listened or read?
I haven't. I was just going to say I'm not aware of this.
And so it's like a book that's been recommended that I read for a long time. And I was like, I couldn't make up my mind on my next book that I wanted to listen to. So I was like, all right, I'll listen to that one. That one, people keep like saying, you should listen to this one. And one of the key points that he makes is that like how much of our communications and communication breakdown is that we are making sort of assessments and interpretations and diagnoses and calling it fact.
Yep, absolutely. I love that.
Yeah. And it's like, no, like that's what you think it is. That's what it appears to you, which is not, and he was given this vignette. He was working with in the prison system, and he was working with this guy in some anger management, and he was like, oh, I'm so, they haven't gotten back to me on this thing. And I'm so pissed about that. He's like, no, that's not why you're pissed. Like, think back to and so it was just a really interesting, we often think that one thing causes another, but there's this thing that happens in between the antecedents and our reaction, and it's our interpretation of that.
Right. And to me, that's where I use that phrase, executive functioning. It's of what is existing in the external environment. A, what are my sensory organs picking up and passing to the brain? B, what does my brain determine is worth bringing into awareness versus what's not? Then what do I do with it? And that happens in the intellect, right? And that's where we tend to focus, is on that intellectual piece. Then once I've come up with whatever it is I've decided is going to work, now I need to get it back out into the environment by making a plan and then executing that plan. And I know I take the tiniest things and break it down to 1,800 points, but it's because, I mentioned before, the brain's desire is to spend the minimum amount of resources on any given task, right? And so we come up with the simplest solutions. And that's ultimately what language and intellect is about. It's about taking a complex experience. In this moment right now, there is so much happening that I cannot hold all in working memory, and I cannot put into long-term memory. So I need some way to compress that data. And that's what analysis and language is for. And that's great because it allows us to take big concepts and play with them much more easily than we otherwise could. But it's also terrible when that means that we're missing some of the original data. Something happened. We walked away saying, oh, that person's mad at me, when that may or may not have been their intention at all, but that's how we analyzed it. That's the language we used. So that's how we remember it. And this is really big because one of the other kind of axioms, right, that I think of is that the brain prioritizes negative information. This is an evolutionary thing, right? That if there's 100 pieces of data and I can only notice 5, well, if 3 of them can potentially kill me, the brain is going to say, I got to notice that stuff. And what happens then is, the truth is that for most of us, and I'm not trying to, minimize anybody's experience, but at any given moment, most of what is going on is, I'll say, neutral at least. Most of the time we're not like freezing cold and hungry, but we don't notice that stuff because the brain says, why do I care to notice that I'm a comfortable temperature right now? Right. And it's that Maslow's hierarchy of needs that once those bottom level things are taken care of, we start moving up and up. So what happens is, if in a day you have, and I know I'm making up numbers, but if you have 100 experiences, but you can only process 10, and 7 of them are bad and 93 are good, well, you remember 7 bad and 3 good. So the next day you say, that was a crappy day. And before you know it, it's a crappy week and a month and a life, So that's why I put so much emphasis on what it is that we're noticing, not to say, oh, it's just all in your head. If you look at it correctly, you'll see your life is great. It's about self-awareness, like you said. It's about accuracy. And I don't need to emphasize the bad because your brain is already doing that. So if there's an inaccurate balance between bad and good, it's almost always going to be that you're over-remembering the bad and under-remembering the good.
Yeah, so we have this, I like to call it the itty bitty shitty committee that lives in our brain and works full time and is telling us all the reasons that we suck. And I'm like, you know what? Like, thanks, committee. But I'm going to actually handle this one. I appreciate you trying to look out for me. It's literally like having a dialogue, like with like acknowledging, like, okay, so there's this automatic negative thought that pops up, and it's like,
right.
But maybe that's not actually accurate. Like maybe that's just one interpretation.
Right. And there's 2 ways to do that. One is to do analysis, right? To use our intellect and get things from other people and reevaluate the data that we remember. Another is to pay attention to different things going forward. So you asked before, and I don't know that I finished saying that we start with the information we have, we make our best guess about what will make this specific problem better, and then we come up with a plan going forward. And the important thing to know is that there's no way to fail that. That if you do it and it works, great. And if you do it and it doesn't work, great. Now we know more to iterate. And if you don't do it at all, great. Now we know more. Because it wasn't that you didn't try hard enough or care enough. It's that whatever that plan was, it didn't work for you. And I try to put things, language, right? This is kind of the core of how we do this work, is cost and value. That for any given thing or way of doing a thing, you have an estimation of what change that will bring into your life, in your awareness, and how much you care about that. That's the value of the thing. But there's also how much of your time and energy and social capital and money and whatever other resources will it take, and that's the cost. And as a general rule of thumb, if somebody believes that the cost is greater than the value, they won't do the thing. If they think the value is greater than or equal to the cost, they will do the thing. The only exception being if you don't have the resources available to pay the cost. That even if you think it's great, you might be out of energy and can't afford it.
The question then can become, what do we do when someone is undervaluing or even overvaluing the cost? And so what I want to do is take a quick break, and when we come back, let's answer that question. So we will be right back. Support for this podcast comes from our patrons. Have you thought about other ways you can support ADHD Rewired? Well, if you are in a place where you can contribute financially, head on over to ADHDrewired.com/Patreon and become a member of our growing Patreon community. I want to welcome our newest patron who joined us at the $5 a month level. So thank you, Stefan, for your support, and welcome to the community. Patrons who contribute at the $25 a month level can join me for a group coaching call that happens every 4th Tuesday of the month at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. This month's coaching call is on Tuesday, April 27th. If you are a patron contributing at the $25 a month level, what's one way you can remind yourself that this month's group coaching call is on Tuesday, April 27th at 1 p.m. Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern? We want to see you there. Our monthly coaching calls are a great way to get a taste of group coaching. Now, if you don't mind the ads and you still want to show a bit of financial support because you find value in each and every episode, you can contribute just $3 a month. If contributing financially isn't in the books for you right now, that is okay. Another way you can show support is by leaving an honest rating and review for ADHD Rewired on your favorite podcast app that allows you to leave ratings and reviews. And don't forget, all levels include being able to connect with other members of our growing Patreon community. I am so grateful for any contribution you can give and all the support you've shown. The support and the feedback that I receive from everyone helps make this podcast and the communities around it what it is, a place for everyone and everyone navigating with ADHD. Find out more about our Patreon community and our perks for each level at ADHDrewired.com/Patreon. That's ADHDrewired.com/Patreon. And thanks. Can you believe that it's already April? Our network has grown so much since the beginning of this year. You can now find all the podcasts on the ADHD Rewired Podcast Network by going to ADHDrewired.com and click on the drop-down menu for podcasts and select ADHD Rewired Podcast Network. There, you'll find links to all of our podcasts and ways to subscribe on all of your favorite podcast players. If you haven't had the chance yet to check out our other podcasts on the ADHD Rewired Podcast Network, we got ADHD Essentials with Brendan Mahan, Hacking Your ADHD with Will Curb, ADHD Diversified with MJ Siemens, and last, not least, finally actually launching this week, the ADHD Friendly Lifestyle with Moira Mabin, where you can now find her podcast and all the other podcasts on our network on your favorite podcast player. And we will probably be dropping a teaser of one of her episodes later on this week on this podcast feed. Here on the ADHD Rewired Podcast Network, there is a little something for everyone. None of us would have gotten to where we are on our own, and we want you to know you are not alone. Want to get to know us even more? You can join me and the rest of the ADHD Rewired podcast family every second Tuesday of the month for a live Q&A. Our next live Q&A is on Tuesday, April 13th at 10:30 a.m. Pacific, 1:30 p.m. Eastern. Go to ADHDrewired.com/events to register and join us on Zoom. It's one of the best ways to interact with other listeners and have a chance to get your question answered live. We also air the live Q&As on our Facebook page. So go to ADHDrewired.com/events to register, like our Facebook page, and get notified. We will stream that live, and we hope to see you there. So we were talking about sort of the idea of overvaluing or undervaluing stuff based on, these sort of decisions that we make on what we do. If we think the cost is going to be worth, or the benefit's going to be worth the cost, like we do it. If not, we don't. So what happens when we are misassessing the value and or cost of doing something?
Yeah. Well, so if we want something to be different than what it is, we want to be doing things that we're not doing or stop doing things we are, or do them differently or whatever, then we need to mess with that equation somewhere. And usually where we tend to start is on the value side, either whether it's ourselves or whether it's we're trying to help someone else, a child or whatever. If they're not doing what we think they should be doing, then we assume they don't value it enough. That, no, you just don't understand. This is really, really important. This is where that kind of try harder, care more comes from. That if I could just explain to you that it's more valuable than you think. The problem with that is that oftentimes they do think it's as valuable as it really is, but the cost for them of doing the thing is a lot higher than we're aware. I'm sure you see this in your clients all the time. And certainly I see it with kids a lot, right? Where if a one-page essay takes you a half hour to do, then it's worth it, for the grade and whatever. But if for whatever reason, it's going to take you 5 hours and a panic attack to complete that one-page essay, then it doesn't matter. If you still understand the value, you're not going to do it.
As you're saying that, I was actually thinking, because I work with a lot of people who are kind of high achieving, very driven, and I see a lot of perfectionism. And so, so this is almost, I think, overvaluing of effort. So, because I tell people like, look, if what the boss or the client is looking for, like they're really looking for is probably somewhere in the ballpark of about an 80% quality, right? Like that's what most people are looking for. And if that 80% quality can be like done in 2 hours and the like 95 and above percent quality takes you 10 hours, like don't go for the 95% quality.
Well, absolutely. Because again, it's all about resource management, right? What is it going to cost me and what is it worth? Is the 15% improvement worth the extra time? And in this case, no. And speaking of perfectionism in particular, I do see that a lot too. And for me, I define it as you're not clear on when you're done. You don't understand. You have the skill to do or create a thing. You don't have the skill to assess a thing as being complete.
Oh, it's interesting. An interesting way to kind of look at it as like a skill to not be able to identify when it's done.
Because if I know that it can get better if I keep working and I don't know when I've hit that line, I don't know what 80% is. I don't know how to see it and define it. Right. Then I'm going to keep going until I run out of time or energy. And that's, talking about cost and value. So we start typically in our culture around value, either by attempting to clarify it, which you can, helping people to understand actually this thing is connected to this other thing that you do care about in a way that you weren't aware of. And that can help. Or we can modify the value by saying, well, if you do this, you'll get this reward, or if you don't do it, you'll get a punishment. And that changes the value, which both of those things can work. The problem with the second one we know is as soon as the person that's modifying the value stops modifying the value, it goes right back to what it was because the cost is still what it was. So that sentence about it's not about getting better at forcing yourself to do things that you don't want to do. It's about bringing your life in alignment. In other words, I'm 6'5". I'm not going to stop being 6'5". I can get through being on a 5-hour plane ride and coach, but I'm not going to buy a Mini Cooper when I go buy a car and then just tell myself like, I should just deal with the suffering that's involved here. I got to change my decisions.
One of the things you just said sort of reminded me of something that I share in my coaching groups. And that's like, say, I don't want to help people just get better at planning. I want to help people plan better things.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I would put it in that you got to know what you want, then plan, then execute. That like, if your goals are in alignment, if your environment, if what it is that you're going for are in alignment with who you are, it becomes easy to do the things that you're trying to do. That yes, there are things that we need to work very hard, which to me is just code for suffer, right? To suffer in order to accomplish, because it's important. It's a trade-off that I don't like to yell at my child. He's very sensitive to sound and it scares him or whatever. So I try not to do it. But if he's about to run into the street, I'm going to yell and stop him because it's worth it, even though it's bad.
My son will always recall, like, I think the 2 times that I've ever actually raised my voice at him. Like, and he likes to like bring it up because he thinks I don't know, like he thinks it's fascinating. Yeah. Time, because he's like, remember that time that you got really mad at me? And I'm just like, oh my gosh, but you have no idea. Like,
sometime we got to have a conversation about how kids are changing over time and why they like remember things differently and whatever. Because my son is obsessed with like death and good and bad and morality. He's 4 years old,
Oh man.
But anyway, so our goal is to lower the cost. It's never to say, here's a strategy. It will definitely work if you just do it. You just got to go do it. Work hard, which again, for me is code for suffer. Because what else does it mean? Spend your time and energy, It means put your resources towards a thing, put more. And so this cultural kind of belief we have of just try harder, it's a quick fix because we can get that. So a version of how this happens, right, is that procrastination as opposed to perfectionism, where I put it off and then I start yelling at myself in my head and feeling terrible and anxious and stressed until eventually that feeling of stress and anxiety is so great that the value is now worth the cost. Because now if I do it, it's not just the task, it gets rid of that feeling. But then I start right back at square one, where the next time I'm going to put it off again until I get that stressed again, and it will work. But is that the way you want it to work? Versus what other things can we do to bring the cost down and make it easier for you to do what you're trying to do? And yeah, that ends up looking like simple strategies sometimes of, changing from trying to read a book to getting an audiobook, for example, that I think I heard you mention that you do. And sometimes it's more complicated and specific, as a general rule of thumb, the more general something is, the more cases it applies to, but the less impact it has in each of those cases. The more specific it is, the less it applies, but the more impactful it is when it applies, So we iterate, we try something. Did it get better? But you have to be able to observe, to notice. You have to have more than fine or not fine to be able to say fine, but now it's fine plus one. Otherwise, it's like, I was fine before, I did this new thing, I'm still fine. So why put energy and time into doing this new thing when really maybe it was an improvement, but you don't notice. So you're looking for these big jumps from like terrible to amazing, which just doesn't happen, or at least not often. You have to be able to notice those smaller distinctions to be able to build and build and build towards something.
So let's do this. What is, if there is like a big takeaway that you would really want listeners to get from this, what would that be?
I honestly thought about this question earlier because I thought it might come up and I was trying to decide, because I have 18 different big things depending on, where I'm at in the moment, right?
The bathtub can only hold so much liquid here.
Exactly. So for me, it is that cost and value piece, to understand, to divorce executive functioning struggles from morality or personality issues. That when you are struggling to do something or not doing something, it is because your brain is making an evaluation that it is not worth doing that thing. Whether you agree consciously or not, there are ways that you can try to influence your brain to change that. We can, change how the brain operates moving forward. But it is not because you are lazy or valueless, or because you just didn't care hard enough or try hard enough. When we don't understand executive functioning, which is an infinitely complex thing, because everything about being human is, when we don't understand it well enough, we simplify it into personality or moral issues. We say, well, that person didn't get what they wanted because they're lazy, but I'm not lazy, so I'll be fine, Or vice versa, if you're me until age 24 or whatever, you say, well, I'm lazy, and that's why all the bad things are happening, and there's nothing I can do about the fact that I'm lazy, so, whatever.
It's funny when we're like just about to end the episode, I realize, I never even asked you to share your personal story. So in 30 seconds, what is it?
Oh my gosh. Trying 1,800 different things and liking a lot of them, and then trying, all right, you know what? Here's a better way to say it in 30 seconds. This is honestly what I believe. As long as you constantly check in and then make a decision to move one step closer to what you want, eventually you'll get there unless you die first. And that's been my life, is whether it's actor or singer or tutor or, going to school in Singapore or whatever, I do in the moment, you make the best decision you can make, but it's a guess. You can't predict the future. And then later you make the next one. And eventually, you just keep getting closer, hopefully.
Brandon Tesser's the website is effectiveartistry.com. We will post a link to your website on the show notes for this episode, which you can either find right on the app you're listening to this on right now, or go to ADHDrewired.com/whatever episode number this is. Just put that number right after the slash, and yeah, so that's how you'll find all the show notes that we'll have for this episode. So, Brandon, thank you so much. This was fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. This was a lot of fun.
This is Eric Tivers. Thank you for listening, and congratulations for making it to the end. ADHD Rewired is more than just a podcast. We are a community focused on learning, growing, and connection. The website is ADHDrewired.com. You can find summaries and additional resources for each episode. You can apply to our free and secret Facebook community. You can learn more about ADHD Rewired's intensive online video-based coaching and accountability groups, and sign up for my email newsletter to get exclusive content you won't get anywhere else. It's all at ADHDrewired.com. While you're there, click the Patreon button. If you're a regular listener and you're still listening to my voice, consider making a monthly contribution by becoming a patron through our Patreon page. If you are able to financially support my work, it would mean a lot. This show is free to listeners, but it is not free to produce. And patrons get really cool perks. You can follow me on Twitter at Eric Tivers. You can like our Facebook page at facebook.com/ADHDrewired. If you're a coach, therapist, or related professional, connect with me on LinkedIn at linkedin.com/Eric Tivers. You can also subscribe to ADHD Rewired on YouTube. And you can subscribe to ADHD Rewired on YouTube and see select interviews and some other videos I've posted. Podcasts change lives. You can make a difference in someone's life by spreading the word about this podcast. Mention it in your online communities on Facebook, Twitter, Reddit, or wherever you hang out online. And be sure to share it with your friends and your family and your clients, as well as your coaches, therapists, and doctors. And if you're a coach, therapist, doctor, or ADHD support group leader, and you would like a pack of podcast postcards to hand out, you can request those at my website, ADHDrewired.com. And if you're a member of CHAD or any other ADHD support group, please be sure to tell them about this podcast. You can even show them how to download it on their phone. You know, you might be the person that turns somebody on to a podcast for the very first time. And if you really love this episode, please consider hitting share on your podcast player. I'm only one person, and I count on you to help me spread the message. One of the biggest things that you can do to support this podcast and to help other people discover it is to leave an honest rating and review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or any other podcast app that accepts ratings and reviews. And don't forget to hit subscribe on this podcast on your podcast app so new episodes are automatically pushed to your favorite podcast app. Looking for more ways to listen and learn? Get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial at audibletrial.com/ADHD Rewired. Not sure where to start? In no particular order. Check out Atomic Habits by James Clear, The Body Keeps Score by Bessel van der Kolk, 10% Happier, and Meditation for Fidgety Skeptics. These are both by Dan Harris. Change Your Questions and Change Your Life by Marilee G. Adams. The One Thing by Gary Keller and Jay Papasan. Procrastinate on Purpose by Rory Vaden. The Four Tendencies by Gretchen Rubin. Do you have trouble asking for help? Listen to The Art of Asking by Amanda Palmer. It's one of the best produced audiobooks I've ever heard. If you're looking for something a little bit more, say, magical, I unexpectedly fell in love with the Harry Potter series. And I don't usually listen to those kinds of books, and I loved it. And of course, if you haven't yet boarded the Brené Brown bus yet, check out Brené Brown's books, starting with The Gifts of Imperfection, Daring Greatly, Rising Strong, The Power of Vulnerability. And if you're an entrepreneur or leader in any capacity, check out her 2018 book, Dare to Lead. And Brené still is my most wanted guest, so if you know Brené, and you would be so kind to make that connection for me, I would be really, really grateful. You know who else I would like to have on the show? You. Click the podcast tab at ADHDrewired.com and then click the Be a Guest button at the top of that page and schedule a 15-minute pre-interview. This is Eric Tivers, reminding you to keep learning, keep growing, and keep connecting. Self-care is not selfish, and no matter what gets done or doesn't get done, at the end of the day, you are still enough. And no matter how hard it feels, we can do hard things. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you next week.